Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the third installment of the Nevada Hotel and Lodging Association series of diversity. I'm your co-host this morning, Michael Testagrossa, and I have 30 years of experience in hospitality and 18 years experience in education.
And I'm your co-host this morning. I'm Nelandra Anselmo. I have 25 years of experience in human resources. I'm now focusing on coaching and consulting with an emphasis on personal development and strengthening relationships.
So let's start out this morning with our agenda. We're going to focus on the what, which is defining bias and reviewing the different types of bias. The why, which is why does it occur and what are the origins of bias? Also how, so working to reduce bias in decision-making process. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with some questions and answers.
And before we start, we will let you know that we have a couple of polling questions today. And so we will start with our very first polling question. If you can participate, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll throw that question up on the screen. We just wanted to know how many of you are in leadership positions in your organization where you can impact diversity and inclusion programs. You do not have to be the diversity officer. You don't have to be a company owner, but are you a person of influence who can make a difference when it comes to diversity and inclusion programs within your organization? You'll mark yes or no there. We won't display the results here. This is just to help us understand in our course evaluation who we're speaking to today. So we'll go ahead and close that out and
so we'll start out with just a general overview of implicit bias, microaggressions, and unintentional exclusions. These are tales as old as time. So as we were putting this presentation together, I was thinking of the story of Beauty and the Beast, and it's a classic example of bias and microaggression. An arrogant prince shows no compassion to a haggard old woman seeking shelter. His actions resulted in him being cursed. While the real-life outcomes of similar actions, fortunately, don't result in cursing, they can result in a variety of negative outcomes, including high turnover, low morale and productivity, and even legal recourse. So where do we start in this process? Treading into the arena of bias is murky waters. And often we refer to bias and microaggressions and exclusions as difficult to assess because a lot of times they're overt or based on unconscious actions. These are more difficult to quantify except in the outcomes. In a 2020 article, there was a quote that organizations spent $5 billion a year on harassment training for a problem we don't diagnose, measure, or benchmark. So often bias and harassment training can fail because the focus is to change people's opinions, which will then lead to a change in their behaviors based on newly learned information. But often after training concludes, people return to their old modes of action. So our focus this morning is not necessarily on the premeditated and overt actions, but those that have the subtle undertones based on bias. Sometimes people make decisions quickly and use points of reference or opinions because they don't have time to think about it or consult with other people and end up using bias in their decision making. Even in companies that have outstanding diversity and inclusion programs, this does not mean that it's going to trickle down and have this not occur. I was having a conversation with a friend a couple weeks ago as well, and she brought up a good point. Her assertion is that discrimination has been part of many cultures for centuries, and that you can't change people's minds. So again, the focus of our conversation this morning is not necessarily to change people's opinions, although that would certainly be a great outcome as well. It's really about impacting about how we interact in the workplace. We're looking to create a level playing field where every qualified person in an organization who wants that opportunity to join a team or for advancement has the same opportunity to do so.
And so why do we even have bias? Well, it starts here. Our brains receive over 11 million pieces of information every second. And every second, we as human beings can only consciously process about 40 pieces of information. On average, we have to make one decision every 2.5 seconds. So think about this. You're driving down the road and you have to decide whether to pass a car on the left or the right. Or you are in the grocery store and you decide to get into this cashier's line or that cashier's line. And so in order to facilitate the processing of so much data that comes in every single day for us, our brains really have to create shortcuts, ways to experience the world so that we can organize all this data. So what our brain starts doing is just categorizing things, just lumping things together in order to help us make decisions, in order to help us function. The good thing is it does work. It helps us to function and to kind of navigate through all the information that comes at us, all the people that we encounter, all the individuals that we need to make decisions about. That's the good part. The bad part, though, is sometimes it can certainly get us into trouble. So bias isn't actually bad at all the time. It's not always bad. Bias just is. Bias is neutral. Everyone has bias. So these shortcuts sometimes can, obviously result in us making quick decisions, but sometimes those decisions are good. So for example, I might just have a preference in some area, and we would also call that a bias. So maybe I prefer to drink tea instead of coffee. And if someone asks, hey, do you drink coffee? Do you like coffee? I say, no, I don't like coffee. That is harmless. I may choose as an individual to eat only organic foods or whole foods because I feel like the chemicals that are put in some other foods might cause harm to me. And so I have a bias there. And that actually may end up being helpful for me. Or when we think about even dealing with people, I might decide not to spend time with an individual because they have intentionally harmed me in the past. And so if I decide not to do that, I have a bias against that person, still may not harm me and actually may be beneficial to me in some way. The problem, though, is a lot of times the bias isn't based on our direct experience with people or our direct experience with things. A lot of times the bias is based on our perceptions of things. And so this is where we get into the idea of implicit bias. So implicit bias, really, it occurs automatically without us knowing it. It's also known as unconscious bias or implicit social cognition. And really, we can get this bias through a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's in our upbringing. It's in the groups of people that we hang around with or our social circles, in person or on social media for that matter. It's in media depictions and the ways that in the media information is presented to us. We start to form opinions. A good example that Michael brought up was that, on the news, a lot of times if there is a crime that's committed, a suspect it may be mentioned that a suspect is of a certain race or ethnicity if that person is non-white. If there is a suspect that is white or Caucasian, they just might say a man. So that would be basically an example of how implicit bias kind of shows up. And sometimes it's very, very quiet, which makes it very, very sneaky. It's how we act on those biases that matter, though. It's important to understand that our actions based on those biases really can eventually impact other people. Here's another side note. Everyone has bias. I'm sure at this point you realize that everyone has it. For people who say, no, I don't have any biases. I treat everyone the same. I see everyone exactly equal. Even when people say that, we want to be wary because what we're probably looking at is a person with many blind spots. And it's hard to understand bias if you're not interested in really looking to see what those are and uncovering those. There have been studies done where people are actually put into MRI machines, brain scans, and people are shown different images or pictures of people or individuals. And when people are shown certain pictures, maybe a certain part of their brain lights up, the part of the brain that's in the front of our brain that looks at empathy, or maybe, oh, I really like this person, or I think that person is attractive. But if shown other pictures of other individuals, sometimes a different part of our brain lights up at the base of our brain. This is where our fear response is, our fight or flight response. Now, these are things that consciously aren't happening for us. They're just showing up in a brain scan. But what happens when different parts of your brain are lighting up? And not only do you not know it, but you're not acknowledging that that could be happening. So bias really can be based on lots of different affiliations, characteristics, demographics. We have some listed here. We said they're kind of preconceived notions about different groups, and unchecked. Really, they can be dangerous, and they really can lead to discrimination. Even when we are aware of them, it can be hard to shake them. So I tell a story sometimes about when I was really young and I was riding in the car with someone. And of course, it was an adult, and the adult was driving, and I was in the back seat, and we were exiting the freeway. And we were on the freeway off ramp, and a person was standing there with a sign that said, homeless, homeless and hungry, I need money. The adult that was in the car with me that was driving, looked over and said, oh, those people aren't really homeless. They actually have lots of money, and they have nice homes, and they have nice cars, and they have nice clothes. And so I'm not going to give them any money. As a child, as a young person, you believe the things that older people tell you. The problem is we don't always know everyone's experience, everyone's story. And so as I have gotten older, that story or that way of looking at a certain group of people, it's hard for me to not think of that every time I exit a freeway and see someone holding a sign and decide whether or not I want to choose to help them. And so it can be very, very hard. And based on, again, many of these characteristics, not just homelessness or socioeconomic, but things like disabilities or age or gender. How many times have we made assumptions about whether someone will be good with technology based on their age? How many times have we made assumptions about whether someone is going to have a good work ethic based on their age? And so we're talking about older and younger workers. And so we have to understand that we value sameness, and people who share the traits and characteristics that we have, we place value on that. And people who have different traits or characteristics are from different demographics, a lot of times we tend to devalue that. And we make these unintentional exclusions, and we do it all the time, these slights. I've been invited on business meetings and well, actually retreats out of town. And the gentlemen in the group go to play golf, and then they tell the women in the group, well, you guys can go to the spa if you'd like. These are based on our preconceived notions about what men are interested in or good at or want to do, and what women should or are supposed to do. You can think of all kinds of these situations in a workplace. Think about inviting the whole group or team out on a Friday night after work for drinks at the bar. And you may have one particular employee who decides that they don't go, they never go. There could be lots of different reasons for that. And if that isn't a part of our experience, we may not understand that someone has a certain family status or observes a certain religion or has certain other issues that we aren't a part of our experience. And then we end up labeling that person as, oh, maybe they're just not a team player. So we have to be careful about things like that. Examples of these can be found, examples of these biases can be found in a lot of different ways. You can check yourself, which is, maybe a good way to do things. But there are also ways that you can kind of uncover these things. Many people now have found what we call implicit bias tests, where you're asked to submit to an assessment or a test where you can decide where your biases lie. One of the most popular ones is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. You can find that at Project Implicit. You can just go online. We do have a link here. But this is something that, is a good start. I don't know that it's perfect. It is research. And so, it's just basically collecting data. You go online, you put in your email address. They don't email you. I've been doing these for years and I've never received an email from them, but I think they're just making sure that individuals are putting in information just once. But either way, you are asked to make decisions, and actually really quick decisions about people in different groups. There are lots of different bias tests you can take based on gender, race, skin color, all of these listed, and then some. And it doesn't ask you, like, do you think that men should go out and earn the money and women should stay home with the children? They don't ask you like that because, of course, if you were asked that, you would say, no, I believe women should go out. But what they do is put up groups of words, and images and phrases, and you're having to really quickly decide what goes with what. And then when you get your results, basically it matches you up with, or it actually reveals data that reflects findings that Americans have preferences for light skin relative to dark skin, or they prefer young over older, they prefer straight versus gay people, or a preference for thin people. None of these surprise us. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't disappoint us and cause us to ask, how this might play out in society or in the workplace. Definitely, it's not going to have a zero effect. And those biases are going to take a lot of different forms.
So in addition to the opinions based on differences, it's how we apply these and either include or exclude people. This is often applied in some of the key stages of organizational growth opportunities, such as recruitment, advancement, and innovation. So we'll talk a little bit about the ones that are represented here and how they apply. So affinity bias basically refers to a preference for those that are similar to you and share the same qualities. So if you were in our last presentation, we talked about hiring heterogeneous groups where there's sameness. And this can be all male or all Cornell grads or all Black. Kind of an interesting twist on this is that the application of affinity bias is also that a person may exclude people that are the same as them because of their own internal identification. For instance, an Asian worker may not necessarily feel affinity toward other Asians and actually exclude them. We have attribution bias. So this focuses on the perception of factors leading to personal actions and actions of others. For instance, personal success may be attributed to hard work and then failures attributed to bad luck. Whereas conversely, we may insinuate that other people who have success, it's not based on their abilities, but based on pure luck or they got a break. Beauty bias is definitely very prevalent in our society, basically favoring people who we consider attractive or have certain traits that we deem as appropriate for leadership positions. This can include physical attributes such as height, weight, hair color, or hair length, and other physical features. Again, this can also be used in favorable and unfavorable treatment. So for instance, if you're a woman and you don't like women that have blonde hair, you may exclude them. We also have the conformity bias, and this is kind of the herd mentality where personal opinions are swayed by others in the organization, particularly with heterogeneous groups. This is more common and applied with recruitment and advancement. So you may be looking at a candidate and maybe one person or a couple of people think, oh, this person seems good, but however, the stronger players basically have influence over that and change their opinion. We of course have gender bias, and this is both in gender and gender roles. So often some positions are deemed as a male candidate or a female candidate based on the job. For instance, you don't see male cocktail servers in Las Vegas, and often beauty bias is applied when hiring those cocktail servers. Women are also judged for assuming traits that are deemed as male, such as short hair or assertive characteristics, or not wearing a dress and high heels. And you also want to think about how this applies to people that are transitioning from male to female or female to male, because that also applies under gender bias. We have contrast bias, which is basically comparing two individuals rather than their individual merit. So for instance, somebody may have all the qualifications that are needed for the job. However, you may focus on certain items or certain standards that are too high. For instance, an excellent candidate for a team leader may not necessarily have held the title before, but has all the applicable skills and knowledge to do so. We also have then the effects. We have the halo and the horns effect. So basically, kind of the halo effect is that person that can do no wrong. So based on one commonality or one thing that they do, We kind of find this, especially when we refer to like as the good old boys network. So, if you're in that boys network, then you can do no wrong. And conversely, again, the horns effect is because of that one particular trait, you may be deemed as, again, unqualified or not viable for certain positions.
And so what might the outcome of these negative biases in the workplace look like? Michael talked about conformity bias and beauty bias. What happens when an entire work group thinks the same way, that conformity bias? What happens when an entire organization makes decisions based on these biases? What happens when an entire industry tends to make decisions based on these biases? Or even an entire workforce, maybe even an entire society. So in our country, here's really what the outcome can look like. These are real stats. They're from a book called Beauty Pays by Daniel Hammermish. 30% of male CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are 6'2", while only 3% of men are actually that tall in our country. Women with blonde hair make 7% more than women with brunette hair or red hair. For every 1% of a woman's body mass, increase in body mass, there's a 6% decrease in income. And then that last one, for each child a woman has, her wages actually will decrease by about 4%. When a man has a child, his earnings tend to increase. And so these are the things that we end up seeing in the workforce when that conformity and that beauty bias takes hold.
So in addition to these subtle inequities, some of the outcomes in an organizational tend to be much more pervasive and deeper dive into diversity, inclusion, and equity. There are some real ways to impact how this basically plays out. So some of the outcomes is this leads to inequality in the workplace. It undermines our diversity and inclusion programs, creates a toxic work environment, disenfranchises many very good employees and leads to the loss, and also inhibits creativity and innovation that diversity and inclusion really strives to focus on. So some of the symptoms that we also find, for instance, there's unchecked power dynamics where employees are not comfortable providing feedback and tolerate disrespectful behaviors for fear of reprisal or being pigeonholed. 1/3 of employees said that they have a difficult time reporting an incident of harassment or discrimination, even after they've gone through training that indicates those actions are inappropriate. In a survey of 40,000 employees surveyed in 125 countries, 34% of employees said that their managers are unaware they have a difficult time saying no. So regardless if the employee agrees with them or if it's an inappropriate request, they don't feel comfortable saying no to them. And 17% said they don't feel comfortable expressing concerns. So this is really where the bias part comes into play, and also that power dynamic of where people don't feel comfortable because they have fear of losing their jobs. When talking about kind of the out group as opposed to the in group, it's also more than just being a part of the cool kids. This is where the group that feels their opinion is unheard and not wanted. 40% of those in the out group are confident that reports of workplace incidents will not be taken seriously. So if you think about that, almost half of the people that are disenfranchised also feel that if they say something about it, they don't think that they're going to be listened to. The more bias that's present, the greater the divide between these two groups, and the more employees don't feel that unconscious bias is being addressed. Only 32% of employees feel that they can be their authentic selves, and we talk a lot about being authentic, and leaving 68 indicating that they do not. So if employees don't feel that bias is being addressed, they won't engage. And again, you lead to disenfranchisement, it impacts innovation, creativity, and your turnover. The last one is lack of commonly understood and practiced norms. So again, it's great to have these Diversity and inclusion programs, however, if they don't trickle down and really permeate throughout the organization and become part of the daily practice, then it really creates a toxic work environment for those people that are in that out group. So what do we do? How do we respond to this? So as Nalandra pointed out, it's human nature to categorize people and put them into boxes, as our brains are hardwired to categorize information. We also do it ourselves with descriptors such as masculine or feminine, tech savvy or challenged. Sometimes we create boxes to designate our personal affinities or hobbies, such as I'm a wine enthusiast or a sports lover or a gamer, based on those interests. We see this reinforced on apps and people checking boxes or hashtags, and then apply the bias for swiping left or right on our preferences to like these people based on just these few attributes. So the pitfall here is that boxes are like stereotypes and limit people based on just one or two traits. But for instance, being a gamer does not preclude someone from being a great cook or a musician or a mother. I bet you thought I was going to say like a father. So again, our notion is that you have to be male to be a gamer, but there's female gamers. Still, it's common for people to focus in on that one trait and then attribute other traits to this person. So for instance, with a gamer, we may say, well, on a positive side, they're tech savvy and they're problem solving. Or on the negative side, and kind of the negative stereotypes is, well, they're lazy, they live in their parents' basement, they're antisocial. This is where the stereotypes come in and the biases that Nalandra discussed. More of a practical application of boxes. Researchers and HR departments have learned over time that boxes don't always fit either. So when you fill out those demographic surveys at the end of applications, or when you're doing your annual employment surveys, you usually go through, like, they ask you your age, your ethnicity, female or male. Even here, people don't fit into neat little boxes. So when too many people start checking off other, or just don't answer that question, it becomes relevant that they no longer fit certain categories. So have you noticed in certain, particularly more contemporary surveys, when they ask gender, it's no longer male and female. They have more expanded roles, so they could include, for instance, non-binary. So gender fluid individuals who don't feel that they prescribe to being male or female aren't going to answer a question when that doesn't fit them. I think we find the same things with ethnicity. It says you have to choose one. So, like, are you Black? Are you Hispanic? Well, maybe you're a mix. So how do you check off? It's like, which do you most associate with? So in the workplace, there's also biases. So job titles define roles in organizations and how they're perceived and valued. The same valuation may apply here where, oh, he works in stewarding, with a connotation that this person may have limited skills or value to the organization. When we put people into those boxes, we really limit who they are and their value and potential. So how do we start to unbox people? Diversity and inclusion definitely are the first steps, but equity is really where you need to step out of the box. When every member of the team is valued and heard, then you begin to move from the bias and stereotype. So as we talked a couple weeks ago about the business case for diversity, this offers businesses new opportunity for innovation, social collateral to attract new markets, but it's really about not just creating that diversity and inclusion umbrella at the top. It needs to be part of the daily actions, and the review of policies and job descriptions. More often, bias may be hidden, along with clearly defined processes for recruitment and advancement. So our next topic is microaggressions. So unmasking and unboxing our initial bias, we need to dig deeper and really reevaluate the organizational process and members to root out our next hurdle. The term microaggressions was coined in 1995 to define contemporary discrimination, which is more often, although not exclusively, enacted in more subtle manifestations similar to bias. And this is focused on disregard, disrespect, neglect. These are basically the actions based on biases. We call them micro because they're small occurrences that sometimes slip under the radar, and they're not that really overt action that would cause you to from a HR perspective to take action on, but kind of subtle and could be daily or quite often throughout the day. So microaggressions are posed to people that are in marginalized groups and things that they can experience throughout their lives. Some microaggressions are unconscious, so the perpetrator doesn't necessarily realize what they're doing, and often unintentional. So they feel, for instance, that they're saying nice things to you when they're not. So it's really tricky to address this, and you really have to be super vigilant. Some different types of microaggressions that come up. We have micro assaults, micro insults, micro indignities, micro invalidations, micro inequities. All of these are very similar, although they kind of play out slightly different. But again, they're often unconscious actions and revert to biases, stereotypes, and profiling. Some examples are, for instance, security alerted to follow a group of people of color through the hotel. And I've seen that happen. Like all of a sudden you just like see security and it's like, what did they do? They walked in the door. I mean, and it's just, they are deemed as suspicious. Another one would be a colleague asking a new hire how she got her job, implying that she may have landed it through affirmative action or a quota system. We then have what ends up happening, kind of the next step is micro dismissals. And these are the reaction or the lack of action in response to any of these aforementioned incidents. They're dismissed as invalid and not warranting action because it's deemed as insignificant. It's just a small thing. Just don't get offended, have thicker skin. But really, if you've been the recipient of microaggressions, you know that it's not just an isolated incident, because oftentimes they tend to be constant and pervasive, even if they're not meant to be harmful. The underlying cause is assumed superiority or privilege based on one person of a group over another. When talking about the stats of diversity, if you compare responses of white males to the voices of diversity, their responses are going to be much different and based on that privilege. While visible leadership roles in bias-free workplace is the top 10 for voices of diversity, if you're a white man, you don't have that same, because a lot of the leaders are white and you don't experience that day-to-day bias. So it can be a hard pill to swallow if you're a white man, to accept that you work and live in a society where you have certain privileges and opportunities that others don't. And if you are part of that privileged group, we're suggesting that you do have a greater responsibility to be more cognizant of that power you have and to help right the wrongs. Our next, a survey conducted in partnership with Fortune magazine with 4,200 individuals found that 68% of Americans believe that microaggressions is a serious problem. More than 26% have definitely experienced a microaggression and 22% were unsure. So they may have, again, they're subtle. So sometimes you don't even think about it. Even going through this, like I went back and kind of replayed certain situations I was in, and I'm like, wow, no wonder why I felt really bad after that conversation. That was totally like a microaggression. Also, 36% have witnessed, and again, 24% were unsure. So you're thinking about half of the people then fall within that either experienced or were unsure of it. So only about half of people said just straight out no, they've never experienced or they've never witnessed it. So that's not necessarily great odds or a great percentage. Another survey by Daryl Wing-Sue of Columbia University found that 64% of women experience microaggressions in the workplace. So again, not great stats there. The most common experiences of microaggressions, which cause up to 25% of workers to leave their jobs. Again, we talked about turnover. These are measurable outcomes. Unprofessional behavior, hearing demeaning comments about peers, or even someone taking credit for somebody else's ideas.
Yeah, I had a couple of examples of each of these. And a lot of times when I talk about microaggressions, I start here. How many of you have ever been in a meeting and you come up with an idea that is a wonderful idea, but it is largely dismissed or ignored. But then someone else in that same meeting comes up with the exact same idea, and all of a sudden they have the most brilliant idea in the entire room. And you're sitting in the meeting going, what just happened there? Did I not just come up with that same thing? Or think about being in a meeting and whoever is leading the meeting is making eye contact with just certain people in the room, or making eye contact with everyone in the room except you. It's hard, and Michael said it's hard for you to, take that one incident and go to your manager or go to HR and say, yeah, I just wanted to make a complaint because he wasn't looking at me. It's hard to do. But when things like this occur over and over again, you have to then wonder if maybe there isn't something going on in the background. We put mansplaining up here. We've been making jokes about this all week. It's so funny. And I thought that we would have Michael explain mansplaining, but then we said no, that he might mansplaining. But it's just when a man decides that he's going to maybe break down an idea for a woman because he assumes that she doesn't know what he's talking about. This actually happened to me a few days ago. There are lots of sports playoffs and things going on, and I asked a question about one of the players, and the response I got from a gentleman was, yeah, well, this player, he was voted MVP. And then he stopped and looked at me and said, that's most valuable player. And I was like, really? Are you seriously trying to explain to me what MVP stands for? So things like that happen. And when they happen constantly, it certainly can wear on you.
So some other examples, as I will mansplain, basically linked to the positions of power. Oftentimes it's explaining something to a woman in a patronizing and condescending way. You can also mansplain to another man, again, if you're in that position of power and it's somebody that's a subordinate. The next one I love is man-interrupting. So when a man interrupts a woman, or again, a subordinate male, but more often women. And it's interesting, so particularly again, when preparing for this, I became more aware and was observing, and I'm like, it totally happens. Other examples, for instance, like Nalondra pointed about eye contact, taking more questions from men than women at meeting, confusing people of certain ethnicities with other ethnicities. So for instance, we had talked about an example that, for instance, confusing, like everybody's, when you say Asian, you somehow just lump everybody into China. It's like, no, there's so much diversity in the continent. So you really need to kind of be aware of that perception.
Or calling someone the wrong name, for example, because you're confusing them with someone else who shares the same physical traits or characteristics. And what it tells us is that you aren't actually taking the time to see those two individuals as two separate individuals. It's when we do that that other grouping that we can fall into that trap.
So other examples are microaggressions. They're quite extensive. Some of these can be backhanded compliments where the praise is woven into a demeaning statement. So an underlying lack of value in a person's ability. Other times it can be clearly biased statement based on stereotypes. Just like implicit bias, many are not intended with malice, but still have the same negative outcome. Some classic examples are, you speak so well. The offense here is that the person doesn't expect a person of color to be articulate, or somebody who is physically representative of a different culture is expected to speak broken English or with an accent. Also, telling people they don't look like or act like a certain group they represent is a stereotype. It can be extremely offensive. And I've heard this before. It's like, for instance, oh, you don't act gay, or, you're the whitest black person. I'm like, seriously, would you say that to a person? Like, these are just, some of them definitely more offensive than others. Other questions, for instance, are, where are you really from? So this statement could be posed to someone who's representative, again, of a non-European lineage. It implies that the person doesn't fit in or isn't American, despite even having been born in the United States. Also, questioning more intimate elements of a person's appearance can be offensive, such as, is that your real hair? Or why are you wearing that to a Muslim or Jewish person wearing something to cover their head? Um, Even possibly the well-meaning statement, you should meet my friend. Or do you know so-and-so? Is said because that person represents the same demographic checkbox. As we've reviewed the bias in unboxing people, it's definitely a misnomer to first think that just because you're of the same demographic that you would automatically get along. I've also had people that are like, oh, you should meet this person because I want to fix you up. I'm like, do you even know? Like, you just met me. How do you know what type I like? The other is that, of course, you would know everybody in your same demographic in your organization. And again, people is like, oh, hey, do you know so-and-so? It's like, why are you asking me that? Is it because that person is also represented? So it's really just those little things that, again, sometimes we don't necessarily think about. So our next poll question is, how many of you have experienced or witnessed a microaggression? And we'll share the results of this.
We'd love to see how this matches up with the surveys that we cited in our materials.
And Alondra and I talked about so many examples of incidents where we both experienced microaggressions, some minor, some more aggressive. Oh my gosh.
100%.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So this is why we talk about this stuff. And it's funny that we haven't been talking about this stuff in organizations. At some places, you definitely have and have been kind of bringing it to the forefront. But if all of us are witnessing it or experiencing it, then that means there's more room to be talking about it. And the other idea here is, what happens when a microaggression occurs? We also don't talk about what to do next. And so a lot of times we say, well, you can confront a person. And if you don't confront that person, you don't feel comfortable doing that, go to your manager. And if the manager is involved, you don't feel comfortable doing that, go to HR. So there was a survey conducted here where employees really were asked just, what would you expect to have happen if someone really commits a microaggression against you? And remember, responding is going to be very, very hard because only 10% of people actually admit to making the mistake, actually admit to committing microaggressions. And since they're subtle, then sometimes they just are unrecognized or just are left alone. But when employees are asked, what do you think should happen? What would you expect? We want to point out that the number one thing is, I just expect an apology. I expect an acknowledgement. And then we look at, like we said before, having the manager speak to that person, having HR get involved, doing some training. But what I really want to point out is that the very, very last item on this survey is having that person be terminated or lose their job. So understanding that it is okay to engage people in this process of confronting microaggressions and bias and just apologizing for them, because what we're looking for is corrective in nature, not punitive necessarily, and not we never want to see you again. And so what we are looking for is just to make sure that we create environments where employees feel comfortable speaking up when they feel as though they've been offended, and other employees feel comfortable speaking up to apologize. So this is where we get into this idea of rebuilding a culture where all of these things feel natural to do. Do you think there are systemic biases built into your organization? It would really be naive to think that there aren't. And so the fact that we have just privilege built into our workforce as individuals is going to dictate that that this stuff probably is actually going on. And so when we talk about privilege, we're talking about just a benefit that a person of a certain group would receive, not that they necessarily earned. It's just that they that it is kind of built into their demographic group. I didn't ask for it, I didn't earn it, and sometimes I don't even recognize it. And that group could be race, or it could be my socioeconomic status, or it could be my gender, or it could be because I'm a heterosexual. But when you have privilege, and it doesn't mean that you didn't work hard for the success, but it does mean that you started out with a built-in advantage at work. So what does this look like in the workplace? When there's privilege in the workplace and I'm privileged, I don't have to worry about day-to-day concerns that other people might be worried about. So, for example, those of us who are privileged don't have to think about things like bathroom access. Is there going to be a place for me to use the restroom? Or getting specific time off for a holiday that I celebrate. If I'm privileged, I always get the time off for the holiday that I celebrate. So that even can be privilege. Available rooms for nursing or pay equity. These are concerns that some people carry with them to work every day that others don't have to worry about. And so when we look at that stuff, we want to make sure that we create an environment where it's a learning environment. And if you're in a learning environment, that means you can ask questions when you need to without fear of reprisal or fear of being punished or put down because of something you didn't know. When everyone's learning together, I'm going to maybe say the wrong thing. I'm going to ask the question and it's going to be wrong. Am I going to mess up? Sure. But we all get grace, I guess is the best way to put it. We all get grace because we understand that we're learning together. And another thing that we have to be mindful of is this self-awareness and this idea of defensiveness. We call it fragility that we sometimes see when an issue is brought up, when someone says, hey, that offended me, instead of right away saying, well, that's ridiculous, or instead of saying things like, you're so sensitive, what we may want to do is just look at assuming another person's experience, another person's perspective. Just because it's not part of your lived experience doesn't mean it isn't real for that person. So we have to promote self-aware decision-making in our training programs. We don't want to rely solely, when we're making decisions, we don't want to rely solely on, survey responses. You don't even want to turn to the person next to you and say, did that seem okay to you? Seemed okay to me, so it must be okay. Really what we have to do is figure out how to gauge these unconscious behaviors, getting feedback, getting alternate viewpoints, especially when you're making big decisions like recruitment and who's getting promoted and performance appraisals. We want to make sure that our standards don't have these implicit systemic biases kind of built in. Checks and balances are so important. And so you do things like blind screenings and everything else that goes along with making sure to be constantly vigilant. We want to check for the existence of double standards in our policies and practices. Oh, it's okay for this certain group to do this. Oh, but when you do it, it's not okay. Or when another group does it, it's not okay. So these are things that we really want to be mindful of.
So how do we cure bias? Definitely it's a much deeper dive and go into rebuilding the culture and has a few different steps to it. We talked about that curiosity and interest in exploring opportunities to change is really needed during this. So we need to put aside our defensiveness and really focus on being authentic in our approach. So kind of what Alondra was talking about, approaching somebody and for instance, if you have a great relationship with somebody, asking them questions, you can even say, hey, did I offend you? If you're comfortable in doing so, and then kind of working and building off of that. But from a kind of a total perspective of looking at it, there's really three stages we need to think about. The first is the systems approach. So this is your opportunity to question the validity and effectiveness of processes in the system and make changes where possible. So like Nalondra just said about having the blind recruitment, that's not necessarily as easy when you're in a big organization, but you could, however, from an HR perspective, just forward applications without names and without, or resumes, and eliminating at least opportunity for bias there. The next part is training. So really conducting impactful training. and encouraging dialogue. The one kind of challenge with training often is that we train and then we're done. And like it's not talked about until next year until we retrain again. So training really needs to be perpetual, and there needs to be follow-up on this. There needs to be evaluation and review and constant check-ins to make sure that really what we're training for, and especially when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, bias, microaggressions, that we're really constantly monitoring it and making sure that people have a good takeaway and that everyone in the organization is engaged. The last one is the authentic exploration from a personal level. So again, avoiding defensiveness, be open to new perspectives, and become an ally. So be a supporter. So for instance, we had talked about employee resource groups. So you don't necessarily have to be within that segment to be a part of that group and show your support. And again, that just starts these conversations, which are very important and help support the diversity and inclusion programs.
So in summary, we want to just look at starting this from a personal level. What are some things that you can do starting today and carrying that out into the rest of your experience within your organization? First, initiate meaningful conversations. That means sometimes difficult conversations, sometimes complex conversations. Have the courage to do that. Learn about the experiences of other people. And again, we say take that position of curiosity. Ask questions, move outside your comfort zone to do that. The next thing is check your biases and then take meaningful action to mitigate those biases. Now remember, checking biases is something that is going to be a personal exploration. Don't hold a group session and have everybody reveal what their biases are. This is a recipe for disaster. What you want to do is encourage people to begin a personal exploration with that. And again, if someone points out that you have offended them, what we're looking for is to drop that fragility, drop that defensiveness, and engage in that discussion. Go back and apologize. And another note about apologies, don't expect the person that you've offended to all of a sudden be your counselor or your teacher on the subject. You may need to find another source to be able to work through that, or you might have to work through it on your own. And again, just like Michael said, definitely be an ally in every way and understand that standing by isn't an ally. That's just standing by.
So just as a recap for our session today, so we talked about unmasking bias and mitigating it. So be aware of the different biases that may impact decisions, especially in recruitment and advancement. You also want to address the different types of microaggressions by being more aware of how comments are perceived and avoid micro-dismissals. And then, of course, moving on to removing bias from the daily interactions, which will help support a more integrated workforce. And finally, focus on rebuilding your culture and really making sure that that culture works for you and works for the inclusive nature.
Wonderful, thanks. And so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So we want to be able to take your questions if you have them. You can use the Q&A function in the webinar on your toolbar. And while we are waiting for questions to come in, if we have any, we'll go ahead and point out that we have really just scratched the surface on a lot of our talks that we've done in the last couple of weeks as part of the diversity series. You can always get more information by emailing us. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. Again, there are other topics that we have been working to develop and been talking to small groups about. And so some of those are listed here if you have other questions about other topics. And I'm also going to, since I'm not seeing any questions yet, I'm also going to give just a little more time today for you to grab a second device if you have your phone or a tablet or another device. If you can just scan our QR code, we'd love for you to submit your responses for our post-session evaluation. It really does help us when you give us that feedback. I'm seeing that we have, I believe, a question here, so let's see what that is. Oh, no, that's just our website. Thank you, Anthony, for putting the website up. And contact info. You're really good. I don't know, Michael T. We may have talked them all out today. We might have we might have given them all the information they need. We'll give you a couple more moments to submit questions if you have them.
Awesome.
Yeah, we put you answered everything. Good for
Great.
us. Good for us. All right. And so one more time, thank you very much for joining us today. We do appreciate it and hope to see you in future sessions. Hope to see you together in future sessions.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks so much for joining us. Oh, wait, I think we have a question. Oh, can we use some of the content if we quote you? Yes, you can always quote us. Absolutely. You can always quote us for sure. We quote other people all the time. So thank you so much. Yeah, for many of you, you're going to take this information back to your organizations. You're going to start small group discussions. You're going to start to build learning and development programs around this stuff. And so our objective was to be able to give you good information to kind of get your program started and to initiate that. And we're here to support you in whatever way you need. But sure, take this information and use it however you'd like. Spell our names correctly when you do it. All right, if we don't have any other questions or comments, then again, please take our post-session evaluation. The code is right there. And thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.